Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, second Paul Y. Hammond Memorial Lecture run by the Ridgway Center. I want to give a particular welcome, obviously, to our speaker, Scott Sagan, but also to Paul's daughter, Robin. And it truly is a pleasure to have you here. Before I go any further, I also want to thank Sandy Monteverde and Jean Hale for all their efforts in putting this event together. So thank you both. I will introduce Scott in a few moments, but I do want to make some reflections on Paul Hammond to start. And I've got a couple of, one statement from Don Goldstein, another former colleague, and then a couple of statements from doctoral students, former doctoral students, I should say, one of whom, Mark Fidner, is actually here. So Don sent me an email, and for those of you who knew Don Goldstein, you'll know that it was in capital letters without any punctuation. But he does say, Paul Hammond was a scholar ahead of his time. He was one of the most respected scholars in the field, and his work on organizing for defense was widely considered a classic. Paul was a founding father of the Ridgway Center and was a gentleman and scholar respected by all. That notion of Paul as a gentleman also comes through in the other statements I will read. Don also said he was in Mexico, otherwise he would attend. Not only was a colleague of Paul, but they actually live close by in Upper St. Clair, and they used to come in together, often in the car together, driving in the mornings to work. And he did ask that his regards be passed on to Robin and other members of the family. So, second one is from Paul Kango, who is now Professor of Political Science at Grove City. Paul says, there is so much I could say about Paul Hammond, but the one description that comes to mind every time I think about him is gentleman. He was a gentleman. Yes, Paul was a renowned scholar with lots of accomplishments, degrees from the top-ranked schools, with wonderful experiences and interactions, and stories from some of the top policymakers during the early Cold War, much of which came from his very important research and work on NSC 68. But behind the letters and academic pedigree, there was simply a kind, decent, thoughtful, measured man and scholar. Patient, reflective, nurturing, mentoring. He really was a gentleman scholar. I will certainly never forget the role of Paul Hammond in serving as a mentor during my PhD. And somehow I've got a page missing, but he was a mentor. Mark Fidner says much the same thing, and Mark says that that's because I've got it on the back. Okay, so here is what Mark says. First, let me say I am biased. Paul was the first person I met when I came to Gispia for an applicant interview, and was also a member of my dissertation committee. In our first meeting, he appeared unassuming and treated me graciously. One could presume that was because I was non-traditionally much older than the average doctoral student and also retiring from the military. That was not the case. It was simply who Paul was. Throughout my very long doctoral process, Paul was always nurturing and encouraging me to persevere right to the end. He treated me as an intellectual equal and helped me tremendously as I worked through some of the conceptual and policy dilemmas associated with working out policy for cyberspace. He even invited me, Matt says, to Merrill's in his home in Upper St. Clair several times, where we continued that discussion. My enduring memory of Paul will be as a scholar, a mentor, and a gentleman. So that's two students. I think you've seen a very similar pattern that emerges here. So I also have a couple of personal recollections about Paul. He was co-chair of the search committee that resulted in me coming to Gispia. And soon after I had read Paul. I'd read Paul as a master's student, particularly strategy, politics, and defense budgets, where he did the study of NSC 68. And soon after I arrived in Pittsburgh, I went to an International Institute for Strategic Studies meeting in Virginia. And I bumped into Paul Nitze, who, as many of you know, was a very important figure in US national security policy and was the author of NS 68, about which Paul had written. And I told him that I was now working with Paul Hammond at Pitt, and he said, please tell Paul I'm still cross with him because of how much he found out about the inside story and bureaucratic politics of NSC 68. The last time I spoke to Paul, I just started at the Army War College in 2007. And I was actually in the room where the photocopier was. And one of the colonels came in. And he was photocopying sections of a book. And he said in passing, some of these older guys really got it right. And I said, who are you reading? And he said, Paul Y. Hammond, Organizing for Defense. So I said, Paul's a colleague and wonderful friend. And I called Paul that evening. And he and Marilyn were out actually buying a mattress. They were in a store. But I told Paul, and in his usual very modest and humble way, he was absolutely delighted that people were still reading his work. I think what you've seen is what a wonderful mentor Paul was, and wonderful friend, wonderful colleague. So let me turn to today's speaker, because Paul would have been very proud, I think, and very pleased with our choice of Scott Sagan as today's speaker for the second memorial lecture. Scott Sagan has a very distinguished academic record. His work on nuclear weapons and nuclear safety contains the same kind of compellingly subtle and incisive analysis of organizations and organizations involved in national security that Paul engaged in. I've had the pleasure of knowing Scott since 1975, when he was at Oberlin College, but then came to the University of Aberdeen, doing his junior year abroad. And I was teaching in Aberdeen then, hadn't long been teaching. And it was clear, even when he was an undergraduate student, that Scott Sagan was very special and had a great career in front of him. In retrospect, if I'd known just how stellar that career was going to be, I would have been much, much nicer to him. So let me just highlight several facets of Scott's career since then. He had his BA from Oberlin College in Department of Government in 1977, his PhD from Political Science at Harvard in 1983. His thesis, Deterrence and Decision, was winner of the American Political Science Association's 1983 Ellen Dwight Reed Award for the best doctoral dissertation in international relations, law, and politics. Dr. Sagan then became a lecturer in the Department of Government at Harvard and served as a special assistant to the director of the Organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. He's also served as a consultant to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and at Sandia National Lab and the Los Alamos National Lab. He also has a very distinguished, well, let me go on then to say a little bit. He was then appointed to Department of Political, well, in 1983, still at Harvard, I'm sorry. In 1983, he co-authored Living with Nuclear Weapons. And he did this with Albert Carnesil, Paul Doty, Stanley Hoffman, Sam Huntington, and Joseph Nye. That is remarkable company to be in early in one's career. And I suspect, from his involvement in that Scott could have had an equally stellar career as a diplomat. In 1987, he joined the Department of Political Science at Stanford University as an assistant professor. He's still at Stanford, but he's now the Caroline Munro Professor at the Department of Political Science, the Mimi and Peter Haas University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, the Senior Fellow Center for International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He has many publications, but let me highlight a few of them. Moving Targets, Nuclear Strategy and National Security, published by Princeton, 1989. The Limits of Safety, Organizations, Accidents, and Nuclear Weapons, again, Princeton, 93. Co-authored with Ken Waltz, one of the premier theorists in international relations. The Spread of Nuclear Weapons and Enduring Debate, Norton, 2012. He's co-editor with Peter Lavoie and Jim Wirtz of Planning the Unthinkable. He's the editor of Inside South Asia. He's a co-editor with Steve Miller of a 2-volume special issue of Daedalus on the global nuclear future. And more recently, he's co-author of Atomic Aversion, Experimental Evidence on Taboos, Traditions, and the Non-Use of Nuclear Weapons, which appeared in the American Political Science Review in February 2013. He also has a very impressive list of awards, including Distinguished Scholar Award from the ISA, from the International Studies Association, International Security Studies section. He had another award, Outstanding Contribution to Non-Proliferation Education, from the Monterey Institute for International Studies. I want to finish this introduction by noting that Scott has also received numerous teaching awards and has an impressive array of research grants from major foundations. He is also, like Paul Hammond, a remarkable mentor to his students. And when I was looking through his CV, I looked at who he'd been dissertation member or chair of on the committee. And it included John Aquila, who was a very distinguished writer on networks and net wars, and more recently, Jake Shapiro, whose book, Understanding Terrorist Dilemmas, is one of the premier books on terrorism. So Scott is not only a great scholar, he's clearly a great teacher and very good committee member. And I'm sure some of our PhD students will be lining up to see if he can be the outside member for their committee. Scott, thank you for coming today. It's a pleasure to have you. Please welcome Scott Sagan.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. Before beginning my formal comments, I do want to make 2 personal observations. First, I didn't know Paul Hammond, but I know his work very well. And one of the reasons I'm really honored to be here is that I consider myself walking in his intellectual footsteps in 2 ways. On the one hand, well, actually on the one foot, if it's footsteps. On the one foot, as was already mentioned, Paul was a real fine scholar of bureaucratic politics and organizational processes. And as you'll see today, I think you need to understand bureaucratic politics and organizational processes to understand many political issues, including questions about nuclear proliferation and nuclear negotiations. On the other foot, Paul Hammond both believed in using theory to understand the world, but believed that our theories and our understandings should help influence the world. And that he always had one foot in the academic, but one foot in the policy world, which is why this was such a great place for him to be. And I've really also wanted in my career not just to write scholarship, but write scholarship that matters. The second personal observation I wanted to make is a note not about Paul, but rather about Phil Williams, to express the debt of gratitude that I owe to him for helping me get into this field. The story I'd like to tell is that when I first went to the University of Aberdeen, I wasn't sure whether I was going to stay, and Phil kindly said, why don't you do some research with me? I'm studying the Mansfield Amendment, the efforts of U.S. Senator Mike Mansfield to pull U.S. troops out of Western Europe, and it would be good to have an American helping me with this project. And I agreed to do that. I knew from my father, who had a PhD in economics, that if someone asked you to be a research assistant, you do your best, because that's your first opportunity to really shine. So I worked so hard on my paper for Phil Williams, because he had been asked to write a paper about the Mansfield Amendment for the Royal Air Force's Quarterly. And I worked so hard, I turned it in, and he called me to his office the next day and said, Scott, I can't use the paper that you've written for me. And I was shocked. I was so disappointed. So why? This is the best thing I've ever done. I was sure that my career had ended that day. He said, I can't use it because it's done. It's written, and there's nothing I can add to it, so I've sent it off to the publisher. So I had my first publication when I was 21 years old in the Royal Air Force's Quarterly, and then Phil and I wrote a second piece together for the RUSI Journal, the Royal United Service Institute Journal, on the Mansfield Amendment. So thank you, Phil, not just for inviting me out here today, but for inviting me into the field of security studies, because it's been a really wonderful ride. What I'm going to talk about today is the dangerous nuclear future. Given the concerns about global warming and concerns about energy security, many nations in the world today are interested in developing nuclear power. According to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that you'll hear a lot about today, some 60 states have asked the IAEA for assistance in developing programs to start building civilian nuclear energy programs. This is occurring at the same time that people are concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons, not just with North Korea and Iran, but potential other states as well, and the risk of nuclear terrorism. So the central puzzle is, can we have the spread of nuclear power without having the spread of nuclear weapons? And I'm going to give a clear, concise, simple answer. It depends. It depends on what states develop these capabilities. It depends crucially on what international organizational constraints that we can place around the development of nuclear power to try to sever its links to nuclear weapons or to reduce the linkages to nuclear weapons. And it depends crucially, and I'll be ending with comments on this, on what happens over the next few months with respect to Iran. Because whether Iran has a deal that will constrain its program, or whether there's either a war or an unconstrained program, or more likely both, will determine a lot about the spread of nuclear power and nuclear weapons in the years ahead. So let me begin by showing this chart. These are the states that have asked the IAEA for help with nuclear power programs in the bottom side, the aspiring nuclear states. And I have a research team that every 2 years looks at the original IAEA list to see what's changed. And Fukushima did make a difference, but not nearly as much. You see here, the ones that I have labeled in red are countries that told the IAEA that they wanted to start a nuclear power program. And then after Fukushima, have said they're going to not have that program. So it's a reduction in the overall number. With Peru, Venezuela, Italy, the only two that already have nuclear power programs are Germany and Switzerland, which have said they're going to phase out. But what's interesting to note is if you do the same kind of chart for the period after Chernobyl, you'll note that 20 states went red after Chernobyl. 10 years later, all but 5 of those states were back in the green box starting nuclear power programs again. So what we're going to be doing is every 2 years seeing how many of the reds have turned green. And my prediction would be that given the concerns about global warming and energy security, you're going to get more and more states at least trying to get nuclear power. Some of them will get it, some of them won't. But there's a movement afoot. And it's important to note the geographical spread. As you see more and more countries in East Asia, more and more countries in Africa, and in the Middle East, and more in Latin America, starting with this incredibly powerful but also inherently dual capable capability. Yes? I think there is a decent chance of that. Now, what you have after Chernobyl, very few of the states that went red stayed red. Some of these are also ones that went the other way. I don't know. I don't have enough information to predict whether those two in particular will go green again. But I do think that you're going to have, over time, a trend for more and more states being interested in moving towards nuclear power. And the IAEA, part of their job is to promote that, the peaceful use of nuclear energy. But as a political scientist, I'm more interested not in the geographic spread or being able to predict exactly which states will move forward, but rather in trying to understand what are the political characteristics of the states. And so what I've done here is take in black the average measure of the states that were listed as having nuclear power today, and then compared them to the average score of states that are aspiring nuclear states, the aspiring nuclear power states, on different political dimensions using mostly World Bank data that the World Bank developed for other reasons, and saying, well, let's see how they map out. And this shows you the great challenge that we're going to have politically as more countries try to acquire nuclear power, but the new countries have much lower political stability scores, have much lower scores on government effectiveness, another World Bank indicator that they use for loans, the independence and quality of their regulatory agencies. Many of these states don't have nuclear power regulatory agencies. They're just starting them, but the World Bank says on their other regulatory areas, they're much lower. Control of corruption, significantly lower on average. The democracy score is lower as well, and you'll see why that's important when we talk about whether democracies are more or less likely to keep to their international agreements. And lastly, a project that I've been involved in through the Nuclear Threat Initiative, former Senator Sam Nunn's institute in Washington, D.C., had a group of experts looking at the known capability to protect nuclear materials, whether they had personnel reliability programs, whether they had help from the IAEA, et cetera. And we found out that on average, it's still not horribly much lower, but lower scores from the new states trying to acquire. So this is a score, just a general broad brush picture of what a challenge we're going to have. Just to refresh people's memory, there are two ways in which nuclear power is related to nuclear weapons. You mill and mine uranium and you enrich it, and you use low enriched uranium, fabricate it, and put it into a nuclear reactor. And that's the way that most light water reactors work. But you could also further enrich the uranium from 4 to 5% to 80 to 90%, use that to make a nuclear weapon, like the bomb that was dropped at Hiroshima. Simple gun-type device or a more complicated implosion device. That's a uranium bomb, but you could also take the material out of a reactor, which is plutonium in the fuel rods, reprocess it. You could use the reprocessed material to put it back into a reactor, making MOX fuel, as the French and now the Japanese are doing. Or you could take the plutonium and make a plutonium-based bomb out of the weapon, out of the materials. So the concern about nuclear power is that it produces enriched uranium and reactors produce plutonium, both of which can be used to build a nuclear weapon. Here is a chart of the countries that have gone forward and have built nuclear weapons. And what you see here is every 5 years or so, another state has acquired nuclear weapons for the first time. From the United States, Russia in 49, Great Britain, France, the communist China. Israel is suspected to have developed its first weapon in 1967, although they have never acknowledged it and the U.S. government does not acknowledge it. India, first testing in 74. The South Africans secretly built 6 weapons under the apartheid regime. The Pakistanis. Then you have 3 states that are born nuclear, do not actually make nuclear weapons, but acquire them when the Soviet Union falls apart. They inherit the weapons, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. And then you have one glimmer of hope for disarmament advocates is that South Africa voluntarily gives up the bomb under the apartheid regime, not wanting to have, during what was going to be considered a somewhat tense transition period, to have the African Congress have nuclear weapons and have to deal with them. They said, let's get rid of them before the transition. Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus are convinced that they don't need nuclear weapons, that they better send them back to Russia where they will be dismantled, and then they can have ties to the West. A great achievement that occurred during the Clinton administration, and then North Korea developing the bomb in 2003 to 2006 when they first started testing. So that's a relatively pessimistic view. Every few years there's going to be another state getting nuclear weapons. But let me show a different chart that gives you a somewhat different and I think more optimistic view of the nuclear future. These are the states that started nuclear weapons programs and then were persuaded or decided not to acquire the weapons. And this is a more complicated chart, but one that's worth spending a little bit of time on this roller coaster, if you will, because there are many states, 16 by my count, that are suspected or well documented to have started nuclear weapons programs and then did not move forward with them. They range from Switzerland, Brazil, Sweden, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Australia, Italy and West Germany very briefly when they signed a secret agreement with France to help France develop a bomb if they would get some weapons back from France. De Gaulle ended that program. The South Koreans, the Australians try again. Taiwan, Iran, Yugoslavia, Romania. But all these states end up getting rid of their programs. And by my count, it's only the Iranians and the Syrians today that have not come entirely clean with what they've done in the past and entirely have given up through IAEA inspections what they have. I don't think there's any one causal variable that explains all of these cases of reversal. In some cases, there are security guarantees and pressure, often from the United States. South Korea is pressured to give up their program when we find out about it. The Taiwanese are told in no uncertain terms, if you want to have relations with the United States, give up the program that we've discovered you starting. In other cases, there's domestic regime change. The South Africans, as I suggested, voluntarily gave this up. Or the Romanians, when the Ceausescu regime collapsed, that's when it's discovered that they had been cheating on the agreements and had a secret bomb program. They hadn't gotten very far, but their scientists had been funded to try to do some experiments. And in other cases, I think there's direct military coercion. Iraq, as I'll show in a moment, had a nuclear bomb program before the first Gulf War, had been coerced and gave it up before the second war in 2003, but had a program, and the war made a difference in 1991 because it got Saddam Hussein to give up that program. Syria would be another case where the Israeli attack in 2007 had an influence that we think in destroying the program, but we don't know all the details because the IAEA has never been given full access to all the different sites. Now, I mentioned earlier that I thought that the regime type mattered. It mattered whether you were democratic or not. I'm going to show you the same data displayed in a different way. So look at this roller coaster chart. And this is another way of presenting the same data. Again, over time, with each one of the states that had a dot before represented with a bar graph instead. And what I've added here is, in red, whether they are autocratic by what is called the Polity 4 data set scores, whether they're semi-democratic, whether they are democratic, whether they're in a transition, and then this is the period in which they are having an active bomb program, and the dot is when they signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I'll go over the treaty in a moment, but the treaty says for the non-nuclear weapon states that they have to agree not to acquire or seek to acquire nuclear weapons. Now look at this for a second. It's complicated, but when doing this data, suddenly something popped out at me, which people have always said, well, you look at nuclear weapon states, some are democratic, some are not. You look at the states who tried to acquire nuclear weapons, some were democratic, some were not. But if you note here, it is only the countries in red, the non-democratic states, that signed the treaty saying that they would never acquire or seek to acquire nuclear weapons, who then either started or maintain secret nuclear programs despite having signed a treaty saying they would not do so. So because of lack of transparency, because sometimes autocratic leaders are less worried about following agreements and being punished for breaking them at home, non-democratic states are less likely to keep their agreements than our democratic states. And you see evidence of that here with each one of the states that had programs after they had signed the treaty: South Korea, North Korea, Taiwan, Libya, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, starting programs, and Romania starting programs when they were autocratic states despite having agreed not to do so. So I mentioned the importance of the NPT and why it's important to have an institution that can try to sever the links, or at least reduce the strength of the links between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, negotiated in 1968, signed in 1970, coming into force, but only for individual states once they agree to sign it and ratify it. And as you saw before, different states did it at different periods of their time. Now, virtually every state in the world, with the exceptions of North Korea, which signed it and then withdrew, India and Pakistan and Israel. All other states, 198 by last count, are members of the NPT, a remarkable treaty. Complicated treaty, as all big international treaties are. Now let me walk you through the five main pillars of the NPT and why they're important for the story I'm trying to tell today. The first is Article 1. Now, during the Cold War in the early years, the United States really didn't mind if our friends got nuclear weapons. We just didn't want Russian friends to get nuclear weapons. The Russians didn't really mind if some of their friends got nuclear weapons. They even sort of helped China at first until they realized that Mao may not be the most stable of friends, and then they pulled away their assistance. But if we help our friends, won't the Russians help their friends, and vice versa? So the first way of thinking about the NPT is that it is a solution to a collective action problem. That I won't help my friends get nuclear weapons if you don't help your friends get nuclear weapons. And the Russians and Americans are the first states to sign the NPT, and they're the ones who really are instrumental in getting it because each nuclear weapon state agrees not to share it with any other state. Article 2, however, says that any non-nuclear weapon state that does not have nuclear weapons, when the treaty comes into force in 1970, agrees not to transfer, not to receive weapons, not to manufacture or otherwise acquire nuclear weapons. And this should be thought of as a solution to a collective action problem for non-nuclear weapon states. Because many of them, as you can see, would like nuclear weapons. But if they get nuclear weapons, their neighbors are going to get nuclear weapons. If the neighbor gets nuclear weapons, will they really be better off having acquired them? Or will they be in the same position? Wouldn't it be better if we could agree that if I don't get nuclear weapons, you won't get nuclear weapons? And the International Atomic Energy Agency, besides promoting nuclear power, their other major and hugely successful role is to inspect reactor facilities to ensure that countries aren't taking away the material to make bombs. So the IAEA provides the inspectors so that states don't have to trust each other. They have to verify through an international independent inspection system that their neighbors aren't acquiring nuclear weapons from the materials that they use from their nuclear power. Under Article 4, the NPT says that all states signing this treaty have an inalienable right to develop, research, production, and use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination and in conformity with Articles 1 and 2 of this treaty. Now, this statement, the inalienable right coming out of natural law, Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson could have written this. It's as if the former Rand Corporation person that I'm sure Paul knew, Albert Wohlstetter, once said is that people had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of plutonium. Now, this inalienable right language was inserted by the non-nuclear weapon states into the treaty, their insistence, because they say if we agree that we won't get nuclear weapons, you have to agree that you can help us get nuclear power. So that's put in there, but it's in conformity with Article 2. That is, as long as the IAEA can say that you are abiding by your treaty commitments, you can have nuclear power. But if they can't, if they say we can't, in a reasonable way, state that this country is still in conformity, you no longer have this right, or at least temporarily have sacrificed it. So in the debates about Iran today, this is a central question. The Iranians say we have an inalienable right, and the Americans and others say that no, you have temporarily sacrificed this right because you've been caught cheating. And this is where international law is so interesting. You have an agreement that has an inherent tension or an ambiguity in it. It's an inalienable right in conformity with something. And that's because both sides agreed to do that and decided we'll work out the details later about how to interpret this. Article 6. Each party of the treaty agrees to pursue negotiations in good faith, leading to a cessation of the arms race at early date into nuclear disarmament. Now, this is often stated as the nuclear weapon states agree to disarm. If you read this carefully, you read that is not the case. They agree to work in good faith on effective measures. Good faith may mean it's really hard to get verification. It's very difficult right now, given the tense relationship, but we'll work in good faith. And when President Obama in 2009 in Prague said, we rededicate the United States to work in good faith, this may not happen in my lifetime, but I want to work for a world without nuclear weapons. That was his effort to try to convince non-nuclear weapon states that we're going to do a lot, and he did a lot. But as we'll see next month when the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference starts in New York, there are many in the developing world, in the non-nuclear weapon states world, who say you still haven't done enough. We're down to 1,500 or so deployed nuclear weapons, back from a peak of 20,000 or so, and they say you need to do more. So that's another reason why the treaty's in difficult times right now. And lastly, a treaty, virtually every treaty that I know of has some kind of escape clause. States want to sign agreements, but want to have an ability, if national security or other things are so gravely threatened, to have a legal mechanism by which they can withdraw. And the NPT is no exception. It states that if you give notice 3 months in advance to the United Nations, you have a right then to pull out of the treaty. Only one state has ever exercised that right, and they did it twice. North Korea, during the Carter administration, announced that they were pulling out of the treaty when they were accused of cheating, because the IAEA had caught them pulling material out of the Yongbyon reactor. And after 89 days, when the United States was threatening to attack, the North Koreans said, okay, we'll stop the withdrawal. Then in 2002, 2003, after the Bush administration accused them of cheating, again, probably correctly, but probably not in the best timing, the North Koreans saw that we were getting ready to invade Iraq, and they said, we're going to pull out of the treaty. They gave 1 day notice, because they had banked the 89 days. International lawyers say, no, you can't do that. So if you go to the IAEA or if you go to the NPT review conference, They actually have a placard for North Korea because it's still disputed whether they legally withdrew or not because they hadn't given the proper notice. But they did withdraw. The United States was busy in Iraq, and the North Koreans then used the material that they had gotten out of their reactor to build their first bombs and used centrifuges that they had acquired from Pakistan, now we believe, to start growing the arsenal. Phil Williams mentioned my work with Kenneth Waltz, the great neo-realist scholar, who argues that nuclear weapons are very stabilizing and we really shouldn't worry about new states acquiring nuclear weapons. The argument is that nuclear weapons are so powerful that any state that knows that a retaliation is likely will behave exceedingly cautiously. Any state, any statesman acquiring nuclear weapons, according to this theory, is going to behave very reasonably and very rationally. But I would counter that nuclear weapons are not controlled by these abstract entities we call states. They're not even controlled by statesmen as individuals. They're controlled by imperfect human beings, by often frail organizations, certainly imperfect organizations, and that when you have governments that have really dysfunctional decision-making on top because of the leadership, because of the yes men who surround a leader, because of dysfunctional civil-military relations, that those states acquiring nuclear weapons are particularly worrisome. And that will lead to the second part of this talk, where I'll give you an example from new research that we now have because of Saddam Hussein's archives being captured in 2003, about what he was doing, why he was pursuing nuclear weapons, why he thought he could use nuclear weapons as a shield and eventually use chemical and biological weapons as a shield behind which he could take aggressive actions and not have to worry as much about retaliation. And then I'll suggest why we should worry about Iran behaving in similar ways and why this deal is so important before I conclude. In 2003, we discovered both that Saddam had stopped his nuclear program under the inspections of the United Nations after the first Gulf War, but we also discovered how serious the program had been beforehand. We've found, this is a discussion that Saddam was having with his generals in 1979, where he describes why he wants Iraq to get nuclear weapons, and it's not for the sake of stability. It's so that he can attack Israel, take back the West Bank, and Israel will be constrained from using its nuclear weapons against Iraq because the Iraqis could therefore retaliate against Israel. So he's not crazy. He's not going to use nuclear weapons first knowing that he's going to have retaliation, but he is going to be very risky. And as you say here, we can guarantee a long war that's destructive to our enemy. We can drown the enemy in rivers of blood. Saddam used to like to talk this way to his generals. We have no vision of war that's anything less. We consider the losses of thousands. In 12 months, 50,000 martyrs can die, and we will keep going. So this is one reason why it's really good that Saddam Hussein didn't get nuclear weapons. But he had a program before the first Gulf War. It was about 1 or 2 years away. He had a biological weapons program with large quantities of anthrax, botulinum, and other BW capabilities, over 180 weapons, and had a really large chemical weapons program that he had used repeatedly against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, and he wanted to have that capability. And then Israel first destroyed the original reactor, and it went underground, his nuclear program. So the IAEA found These are two maps produced by Laura Rockwood, a friend and colleague at the IAEA, who was involved in the inspection. She was the chief legal counsel for the IAEA at the time. And it showed one of the real flaws of the NPT, which as originally conceived, the NPT says that you have to sign this agreement, you have to declare what your nuclear power sites are, your reactors, your research, and the IAEA has a right to have normal inspections of those facilities. So this is a map of the Tuwaitha facility showing what Iraq had declared: a fuel fabrication laboratory, a reactor, and a second reactor. And then after the war, they went back in and found right next door, literally across the street, were all the secret nuclear weapons development programs, but they were not allowed to go knock on the door across the street. They could only go into the places that were declared sites. And they found an HEU recovery program, weaponization activities, a laser research and support, another way of trying to enrich uranium, clandestine isotope irritation, all sorts of things, including reprocessing, that they had not been permitted to look at. And that's how they got this estimate that Saddam was a lot closer. Why didn't Saddam wait? And this gets at this point I made about yes men. Saddam was surrounded by people who were petrified of him, for good reason, often. And if you're in a bureaucracy with a person like Saddam Hussein on top, you tell the dictator what you think he wants to know. So when his nuclear program's going poorly, his chemical and biological weapons people are saying, oh, sir, we're really perfecting this stuff. It's much better than what we used against Iran. And Saddam is telling them in conversation with his advisors, we have stuff that's 200 times more powerful than what we had. Not only did he tell them that, he publicly says, by God, we will make fire eat up half of Israel if it tries anything against Iraq. We don't need the atomic bomb. We have the two chemicals. Whoever threatens us with an atomic bomb, we will annihilate him. And we also know from these tapes that we captured, here he is with one of his generals and his son-in-law, whom he later murdered in cold blood after the son told the IAEA inspectors where the nuclear facilities were, that we will make sure that the chemical and the germ bombs are available. So he pre-delegates authority to some senior generals that if I'm gone, if you get to Baghdad, if the Americans get to Baghdad, where Israel or the United States uses nuclear weapons, I want you to launch all that stuff. And he names the exact targets: Tel Aviv, Riyadh, American bases in the region. Now, they had a sizable biological and chemical facilities and weaponry in 1991, nothing like 200 times as powerful. That's Saddam listening to yes men too readily. But he considers this to be a shield behind which he can attack Kuwait. And instead of waiting for intelligence about how the United States would react, he forbids intelligence outfits. I don't want intelligence organizations to give me analysis, he tells them. Why? Because he's brilliant. He has vision. He understands this. Some of this I do out of deduction, some through invention and connecting the dots, all without having hard evidence. So he makes the decision to invade Kuwait, thinking he has this shield behind which the United States and Israel won't be able to respond. And shockingly, after we do, we stop. I think it was the right decision under George H.W. Bush. And then Saddam tells them, see, it worked. I didn't get to keep Kuwait, but the Americans and Israelis didn't attack Baghdad. And when we threatened to keep going, that's when he says, okay, under the peace terms, we'll open up our nuclear and chemical facilities, and the inspection system worked. So this is a dark lesson, one about the dangers of certain kinds of regimes getting weapons of mass destruction. It's also a somewhat positive lesson that with the right incentives of inspections, you can actually be pretty firm. In my own view, although this has not yet been confirmed in all the evidence, is that Saddam Hussein, by 2003, knew that he had gotten rid of everything, thought that the Bush administration was fabricating the evidence, and therefore he didn't want to continue going along, and that's why he was kicking out inspectors, because he thought that we were getting ready to attack anyway. It wasn't because he was trying to deter Iran or create some ambiguity. He thought that we knew that he had given up everything, and he would be damned if he was going to humiliate himself and his own people by letting Americans go into his palaces and do further investigations. So let me turn in the last few minutes before opening this up to talk about Iran's nuclear program. I think it's very important to try to understand where they are in the program and why they are doing it in order to try to at least understand something about their negotiation position. Now, the IAEA declared here in 2000, this one's from 2011, but there are a number of reports that go through all the different materials about what suspicious activities caused the IAEA to repeatedly tell the United Nations that they can't confirm that Iran is in compliance with its NPT agreement not to try to get nuclear weapons. Because they did a number of things. People suspect from some stolen computers, from some intercepts, from some people who left Iran. They were testing implosion-type devices. They had communication links between the nuclear program and the missile program. They did some reentry vehicle work on missiles that makes sense only if you have a nuclear weapon, plan to put a nuclear weapon on board. They found instructions for how to make uranium metal hemispheres, which are useful for weapons but not for other purposes. That one, since they actually found the blueprints for this, the Iranians couldn't deny it and said, oh, they had gotten that from A.Q. Khan in Pakistan. They didn't ask it. It was like a party gift. So don't blame us for having this. And they said, well, you should have given it back. You shouldn't have waited for us to find it. And this is why the IAEA still today insists that they can't confirm that Iran is in full compliance. Now, what's interesting is that the U.S. CIA says that they believe that all these activities took place just before the 2003 period where we started finding out more about it, and that a CIA report in 2007, the National Intelligence Estimate, says that Iran has not currently restarted that program but has that technology, has that knowledge, and we need to find out more in order to cooperate with them. Now, from a security studies specialist, it's not unusual that Iran would have started those nuclear weapons programs. Indeed, the Shah started his nuclear power program, and we now know, secretly, told his advisors in '73, that we want to have a peaceful nuclear program now, but get the technology so that if anyone in the neighborhood gets the bomb, we must be ready to have it. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who when he first came in, did shut down the Shah's program. After the war in Iraq, we now know from private letters that were later published in Iran, said that the commanders said that we need to have laser and nuclear weapons to confront the attacks from Iraq. So that's where we believe the Iranians restart their nuclear program at the end of the Iraq-Iran war, and even a relative moderate like Rafsanjani, after Saddam uses chemical weapons against the Iranians, says the moral teachers of the world are not very effective. We have to fully equip ourselves in defensive, offensive use of these kinds of weapons. And this is exacerbated by the United States. When the Bush administration publishes its classified nuclear posture review in 2001, portions of it leak,
And many papers report that the U.S. nuclear planners are being told to prepare to use nuclear weapons against Iran if necessary. In 2002, President Bush announces an axis of evil: Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. North Koreans pull out of the NPT. We attack Iraq. Not so surprising that Iran would get really interested in moving forward with their program. And in 2003, after the fall of Baghdad, Sonny Efron from the LA Times asked an unnamed senior Pentagon official, what message should Tehran get from the fall of Baghdad? And he said, take a number. It's like at the deli. You're next. You're next in line. And this was not unobserved in Iran. And so the negotiations, which I think had a chance to work in 2003, really become far more difficult because the Iranians are really concerned about a potential American attack and want to create a capability. Also concerned that if they get caught cheating, so they start covering up stuff and won't let the IAEA in. And the United States originally demands a full end of all nuclear power program, the uranium enrichment, and they say no. How can a side that wants to topple the regime also attempt to negotiate? Now, Iran is still mysterious in lots of ways. The IAEA does not have full access to its site. But let me show a couple final slides to give you a sense of at least my sense, although I wish we had more evidence, is that there is very broad support for nuclear power in Iran today. All the polls suggest very high support across all age groups, reformers to non-reformers, but deep splits on nuclear weapons. The reformers and industry would love to have nuclear power and to do it cleanly and do it openly, to get the access of international trade, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard would like to have nuclear weapons. And I think one of the great ironies of the current sanctions regime is that it makes the reformers want to have a deal so they can have economic benefits, but it actually helps the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, because they're the best smugglers in the country. They benefit. Indeed, some people think the Revolutionary Guard Corps wouldn't mind an attack because it would get more resources from a bureaucratic politics perspective going into the Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're the ones who protect the nuclear sites. They're the ones who have been running the program. And so it's not surprising that they're the ones trying to put the constraints on the negotiations in Tehran. The mullahs, I think, are mixed. They've issued a fatwa, or claim to have issued a fatwa against chemical and nuclear weapons. Iran has refused to put that into a legal document, claiming that we don't need to have legal documents after you've had a fatwa. There's some evidence, as I suggested before, that Ayatollah Khomeini both really did originally cut away from the program, thinking that this was a wrong weaponry under Islam, but then restarted it again, or permitted it to be restarted again when Iraq went to war. And it was at least possible, my own interpretation is that the mullahs want to stay in power. That's their highest priority. And if they need to get a deal to stay in power economically, they're willing to do that. If they think they need to get nuclear weapons to stay in power because of fear of attack, they're willing to do that. And they could go either way. But I love to show this picture. This is the middle of a 50,000 real note, equivalent like a $5, $6 bill. Probably less today after the sanctions in Iran. And they have imposed the popularity of a nuclear power program by putting the atomic symbol on their own currency now, with the statement saying that even in science, even if science is in the Pleiades, if it's in the stars, some men from the land of Persia will attain it. So nuclear power is enormously popular across all parties in Iran today, and I find it inconceivable that any government will give up nuclear power. They may constrain it to give up nuclear weapons or reduce the likelihood of getting nuclear weapons, but I think there's no way we can get them politically to give up nuclear power, spread all around the country, but we're really concerned mostly about the uranium enrichment in the plutonium plant. Right now, Iran has 18,000 centrifuges, enriching uranium to low levels, but a lot of it. They've agreed, as part of the agreement, to reduce the number, and at least the current reports are that if this agreement goes through, Iran will agree to maintain 6,000 centrifuges and only enriched to below 5%, to create a stockpile of low-enriched uranium. There's still debate about where that will be kept. Can they keep all of it or not? But there's a deal struck about the rough shape of the uranium enrichment program. There is potential agreement, at least some reported progress, that the underground facility at Fordo, the Americans went in saying we don't want any enrichment to go on there because that's harder for us to destroy if it starts making weaponry. And the compromise seems to be that you're going to convert that from enriching uranium for power plants and potentially for bombs to rather to make isotopes for medical, industrial, and scientific uses. You're going to hear a lot about molybdenum in the next couple months because one of the options is to use that for medical isotope production to make for medical research, which would pollute the centrifuges away from using them for low-enriched uranium for a bomb because of the materials that would be less pure inside of them. And they have agreed, although the details haven't worked out, to reduce plutonium output at the one research reactor that is would be highly likely to produce large amounts of potential plutonium. And they're nuclear, but there's still to be serious unresolved issues, which is why we didn't have the agreement. When I agreed to talk on this subject, I didn't realize that it would be such a moving target that just yesterday we'd have to do this and I'd have to redo the slides. But there's still disagreements about what kind of R&D there'll be, how much of the uranium can be kept in Iran versus being shipped back to Russia under Iranian ownership but under Russian control. What's the timing of the sanctions relief versus constraints on the program? How long will it last? And I'll end with this last comment about must Iran come clean on their past activities? I think this is going to be really tricky because the IAEA in the United States would like Iran to admit all the things that they did so we would know exactly how much knowledge they have. The Iranians can never do that because in order to do that, they're going to have to acknowledge that they've been lying for all these years. And that may be a step too far. So either we're going to see, I think, the United States back down on that, or we're going to see a remarkable miracle that Iran will declare that somebody in an unauthorized way did all of this and we didn't know about it. We didn't order it as an excuse, and it'll be a real transparent fabrication. So this is the last picture, is a final picture of the Bushehr nuclear reactor in Iran. Will there be a deal? And I don't know. And I don't know because negotiators in Switzerland don't know. And the Iranian negotiators know that the final deal will not be hammered out in the tables, negotiation tables in Switzerland. They're going to be hammered out in the bureaucratic politics and domestic politics in Tehran and in Washington. As I suggested earlier, there are some people who really want to make a compromise in order to get economic strength and make Iran to be a normal state, or at least move towards a normal state with its relations with the rest of the world. There are other actors in Tehran who are fence-sitters, who could go either way. And there are some actors in Iran who do not want to deal at all and would not mind if sanctions continue, and may not even mind if there's an attack, because they know that an attack is the best way for Iran to get nuclear weapons eventually. Because all constraint in the underground program would end if there's an attack on Iran. Which one of those sides will win out in the bureaucratic politics? I don't know, but I do know that if we hold up a mirror to the United States, the same kind of analysis could be used to try to understand what's going on in Washington today. But that's another lecture, and we have time for questions and answers today. So thank you very much. So if you could raise your hand, and if you could identify yourself and what your affiliation is, that would help me understand the audience a bit more. Is it working? But this is being recorded, so we need to have a microphone.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you again for coming to speak with us. My name is Kelly Wadsworth, and I'm a PhD student in my first year here at GSBA in security studies. And I was wondering if I could get your perspective on how ethical you think it is for nuclear powers like the US to tell other states, pressure other states to disarm or stop pursuing their own programs, especially when we won't even commit to a no first use policy.
It's a great question. As you may know, but people who are not in security studies may not know, I've been arguing and have written many articles about why the United States should move towards a no first use policy. So I'm disappointed that the United States has moved only partway there. Prior to the 2010 Obama administration nuclear posture review, the stated position of the United States was that we hold open the right to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states if they use chemical or biological weapons against us. And I argued that in the nuclear posture review process that we should go all the way to have a no first use policy. And that is both, I think, more moral, but also, I think, more strategic. It's a wiser policy for us if we're trying to reduce pressures on other states to get nuclear weapons. The Obama administration went partway there, and in 2010 issued a statement saying that we promise that we will never use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state that is in good standing with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even if we are in a war with that state, if they have used chemical or biological weapons against us, we will use conventional forces in response and would hold the leader who used such weapons, would hold him or herself responsible legally for having violated international norms and legal norms. I think that's a more moral and a better position. There are some who argue that our refusal to go below 1,500 is another immoral action because we're not doing enough. And my own view there, again, is one of disappointment, but not of not believing that this is an immoral action. I think there are reasonable arguments for why we can't go lower unilaterally. And the Obama administration now is engaged in an internal process to try to figure out, do we really need all 1,500? If we do cut unilaterally, does that signal to the Russians that they should just keep all of their weapons? Are we better off? Or should we hold open some and try to reopen another round of the START negotiations? And I think that's a reasonable debate. I don't hold people responsible one way or the other. I wish we had gone further towards no first use, but I applaud the administration for going as far as it did.
Hi. Dr. Sagan, thank you for a great talk. I'm Tom Congedo, and I'm the Associate Director of the Nuclear Engineering Program here at Pitt. Several years ago, Ambassador Joe DeThomas came by. He was working with the Civilian Research and Development Foundation at the time. And he was speaking about a desire for nuclear everything on the part, on the one hand, of Iran and of the Arab states in the Middle East. While we're talking, we're speaking about the United States and Iran and other members of the group in Iran. Is there an undercurrent of Persian Empire versus the Arab nations driving some of what we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me make 2 points here. I mean, one is clearly there are a lot of states in the Arab world on that list of countries that are interested in nuclear power. Only one, Saudi Arabia, has said that we're actually going to go for weapons if Iran gets weapons. The others are moving forward with nuclear power, but with the belief that maybe they could withdraw from the treaty at some point if they acquire it. One thing I did not mention that I should have is that after that discovery at Tuatha by the IAEA, they said the current system of only inspecting declared sites is not enough. So they negotiated for a number of years and rewrote something called the Additional Protocol. An Additional Protocol states that if you sign this, you have to, by law, let IAEA inspectors in on 24-hour notice to any site in your country. And a number of countries have ratified the Additional Protocol. So the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is actually building their first 6 nuclear power plants with South Korean assistance. They've not only agreed that they're not going to enrich their own uranium or reprocess plutonium, but they've ratified the IAEA Additional Protocol. I think we should have as a stated policy that we will not assist any country in building nuclear power facilities unless they sign that Additional Protocol. Now, the problem here is that even if we agree to do this, and this gets, again, at this question about multilateral, the Russians don't agree to that. So should we let the Russians get the nuclear commerce? To me, this is a real issue where the current state of disarray between Russia and the United States is hurting the tradition of non-proliferation cooperation that we had even at the height of the Cold War. It's actually reduced in some ways today. So yeah, you're spot on. There's a dynamic in the Middle East to wait to see what happens with Iran, but they're hedging their bets by starting nuclear power, and not all of them have ratified the Additional Protocol.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. It was very enlightening, especially because I have a personal interest in the Iran nuclear discussion right now. So this past summer, I had the opportunity to attend a National Defense University occasional paper release by authors John Caves and Seth Saris on the future of weapons of mass destruction and their role in 2030. And I asked them a question. Where do we draw the line on counterproliferation and non-proliferation of WMDs and their related materials like ballistic and cruise missile and UAVs? Where do we draw the line between that and countries' sovereign rights to acquire self-defense and or deterrent purposes? For the fact that how does the U.S. do both of those at the same time increase conventional force projection in certain regions? I was wondering if you could answer that for me.
It's a big question, and I wish I had their notes to help me. First off, there's a real difference between acquiring some of those capabilities, missiles and UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, so-called drones, and chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons. Because acquisition of chemical and biological weapons, with the exception of a handful of states that didn't sign those treaties, is illegal. It's not just a question about morality, it's a question of a legal mechanism that they've signed treaties. So we have not just a right, I think we have a responsibility for the sake of international law to punish countries that are found to have secretly acquired chemical or biological weapons. And that's why it was such a tricky situation when President Obama drew the red line over Syrian uses, and they didn't use them against adversaries, they used them against their own people. And he felt that the United States had to punish the Syrian regime, and yet the Russians pulled a rabbit out of the hat by getting Assad to get rid of his chemical weapons, to reduce our role, and I think that was a better option than actually going to war, but it was an unusual one. Nuclear weapons, we do have a right to stop countries from getting nuclear weapons once they've signed a treaty that says they will not do that. Where it becomes trickier is for the 3 states that didn't sign the treaty, and I think we have rights and responsibilities to put pressure on them to disarm, but we don't have the legal mechanism in the case of Israel, India, or Pakistan. We can regret what they've done, but we can't say what you did was illegal and therefore we want to put UN sanctions of the sort that we put on other countries. Yes? Oh, well, I'm sorry, there's a microphone behind you first, and then you, Martin.
Sorry. I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. So I'm a first-year PhD student in engineering and public policy at CMU. My name is Alexandra Kosorova, I'm from France. And I have 2 questions for you. And actually the first one is slightly outside the scope of that presentation. So if you don't want to answer it, I would understand. It's about the ethics of nuclear. And I would be interested of knowing your stand on the decision of the US of dropping nuclear bomb in Japan at the end of World War II. And the second one is we used to talk about the nuclear clock during the Cold War. Have you some insight about where we are standing right now on that clock? Thanks.
Repeat the second question while I'm jotting it down.
The second is regarding, we used to describe the tension between Russia and the US, describe it in terms of the nuclear clock, and where could we be standing right now on this clock if it was still on? Thanks.
Okay. On the first one, I've got very strong views, so let me try to express them. It'll take me a few minutes if you don't mind. In 1945, after both bombs were dropped, the Gallup poll did a public poll of the United States public and discovered that 23% of the American public disagreed with Truman's decisions, but not for the way that you think. They disagreed that he gave Japan a chance to surrender and said that we should have continued dropping more atomic bombs and not let Japan surrender. Now, I found that to be shocking when I first discovered that poll and thought this was the anachronistic view of a public that had been exposed to the horrors of the Second World War, of Pearl Harbor, of the Bataan Death March, of the beheading of U.S. captured POWs by the Japanese Army. Until Ben Valentino and I did some recent polls that showed that 19% of the American public wanted to use atomic bombs against al-Qaeda, even when the Joint Chiefs of Staff in our experiments said, we can destroy the target with conventional weapons only. Nuclear weapons are not necessary at all. 19% of the American public wanted to use nuclear weapons anyway. And to us, that suggests that there's a retribution instinct among many. I would hesitate, because some people can say retribution can be a moral view. Whether it's moral or not, it's not a view that I would hold about appropriate uses of nuclear weapons. But it does suggest that there is not a nuclear taboo per se, and that in our experience we were able to increase the number of people people who supported using nuclear weapons against al-Qaeda, if the Joint Chiefs would say this will be helpful against destroying the target, we could get it up above 50% very, very quickly. I found this to be really disturbing evidence. On the 45 decision, I'm actually writing something about this. I've been going to Hiroshima for the last few years in August, and I'll be back there on August 7th, the day after the 70th anniversary. And my own view is that we've misunderstood what happened, in part because of a deliberate policy of the United States to obfuscate how the decision was made, and especially how the decision in Japan was made to surrender. The traditional view that Harry Truman and Henry Stimson and others put forward was that if we had not dropped the bomb, Japan wouldn't have surrendered, we would have invaded. Estimates that you see in the later constructed memories are that 500,000 to 1 million U.S. troops would have died, and therefore this was worth it. Harry Truman would later claim that he never lost a moment's sleep over dropping the 2 bombs. But in reality, we knew that Japan was getting close to surrender. We were listening to their mail. We had intercepted through the magic code, and we knew that they had sent diplomats to Russia to try to get an agreement, to see if Russia could broker a surrender agreement. And we also knew that in the end they agreed that they would accept the Potsdam surrender document, unconditional surrender, except insisting on the condition that the emperor be kept in power. Now, after the 2 bombs were dropped, Harry Truman, who earlier had said, we have to have complete unconditional surrender, asked James Burns, the Secretary of State, can you craft a letter that could tell the Japanese that we're not going to put the emperor on trial, but could also tell the American public that we have unconditional surrender, even though it's sort of with one condition now. So as lawyers are trained to do, they crafted a deliberately ambiguous letter that got the emperor to tell his family that we're not going to be put on trial. The other guys will, but we'll still have the emperor system. And then the United States accepted unconditional surrender, knowing that the emperor was going to stay in power. So the dropping of the bomb influenced both sides. And what we don't know and can't know is if we had agreed to let the emperor stay in power, despite the fact that I think he actually was a war criminal, if we had agreed earlier to let him do that, would the bombing have been unnecessary? It is certainly possible, but we never tried it, and therefore we can't really know for sure. On the last point about the Cold War, let me just make one point and then turn to the next question. I'm enough of a realist to believe that nuclear weapons did have a constraining effect on the Cold War. But the more I look at the number of close calls, the safety violations, the accidents that occurred, the more I think of these weapons as being just a really dangerous insurance policy, and that you may need them if you're really in grave danger, but you don't want to rely on them forever. So the way I've put it is that nuclear weapons are like walking across, using nuclear weapons for your national security is like walking across thin ice. The fact that you do it once or twice does not mean you should try to do it all the time. It's an exceedingly dangerous practice. And therefore, that's why I've devoted a lot of time to try to think about how can we reduce the numbers and the roles and eventually get a world without nuclear weapons. You had a question here?
Scott, I've got 3 people,
Okay.
and what I'd like to do is give each one a chance to ask a question, but you respond then to all 3 of them at the end, because we do have an appointment for you with some of our doctoral students. So first one's Dan.
Dr. Sagan, my name is Dan Andrews. I guess be a graduate from this past winter. I was hoping if you could provide new perspectives or information that would give credence to the idea that a rogue nuclear state, whether Iran or another nation, would knowingly distribute nuclear weapons or components, technology, to violent non-state actors.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm also a GISPIA grad student. And I was just wondering if you saw any role in the development of non-nuclear renewable energy resources and technologies as a means by which to kind of counteract nuclear proliferation, particularly in countries that don't already have a substantial investment in nuclear development.
Martin.
Are you sure there's no other student? In your writing, I think you use a categorization of nuclear optimists and nuclear pessimists. And I want to ask you about the nuclear pessimist category, because that is defined, or you define it as people who don't think that all of these efforts at non-proliferation are worthwhile, because the technology, one way or the other, is going to get to people who would like it. And so it's really impractical and irrelevant. I'd like to know if you think, in the perspective you've been talking about today, if that category is correct in its assumption, and whether it's getting more so or less so. Thank you.
Yes, no, yes. Is that brief enough? No. Rogue states, I don't think there's evidence that any so-called rogue state has given nuclear materials or weapons to a non-state actor. We have the strong evidence about A.Q. Khan. I think A.Q. Khan took one for the team when he said he did this all on his own, and that the Pakistani government, or at least senior members of the Pakistani government, were deeply implicated and just did not want to acknowledge that. But he was selling to other states. Well, you do have the problem, as I suggested in that one last far right-hand chart in the earlier point about the nuclear threat initiative, is that a number of so-called rogue states have really bad physical security on some of their sites, and therefore we should worry about that. On other forms of renewable energy, I'm all for that. I do think that if we're going to avoid global warming or reduce it, nuclear power still is likely to play something. It should play a modest role, but it has to play a role by almost all of the estimates that you see in terms of the pie charts. And the question is how big of a role. And I'd like it to be as smaller as possible if we can move forward with those others. On the last question about controlling the technology, I guess I'm a pessimist in that way, is that I think that there are states who are going to try to acquire the power technology and will not do it well. And there are states who may try to acquire the weaponry, and we have to do everything to try to reduce the likelihood that they will get those capabilities, because I don't believe that they will be responsible holders. So that, to me, is the lesson of much of these charts, which is there's going to be a spread of nuclear power, but we have to do what we can, not just in terms of who gets it, but what are the international institutions that we can create to try to manage what is inherently a dangerous technology. I'll conclude there.
Scott, thank you very much indeed. This is something to remember your visit to Pittsburgh by. And I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Robin in particular for delighted she's here. And I also want to thank Sandy. If you could take a bow for putting it all together. And if Jean Hale is around, I would like to say the thanks to Jean, because she's also been very supportive of us, and I think there's some flowers there for Jean. So thank you all for coming, and I hope we will see you again next year. Thank you.